Imagine you are the most powerful empire in human history. At your peak, you controlled a quarter of the Earth's land surface and a quarter of its population. Your navy ruled every ocean. Your currency was the world's reserve. Your language became the lingua franca of global commerce. When you spoke, governments trembled. When you acted, continents changed. Now imagine that all of that is gone. Not slowly, not gracefully, not through the dignified retirement of a great power that has decided to step back from the stage. Gone in a single humiliating weekend. Gone because a country that you once considered a junior partner in civilization picked up a telephone, threatened to destroy your currency, and watched you fold like a cheap suit. That is what happened to the British Empire in November 1956. And the worst part, the part that makes this story genuinely extraordinary, is that Britain then spent the next 2 decades pretending it hadn't happened, maintaining the posture of a great power, keeping the bases, flying the flag, sending the gunboats, all on borrowed money, borrowed time, and borrowed prestige. The Suez Crisis is taught in schools as a story about colonialism, about the Middle East, about Egyptian nationalism. And it is all those things. But at its core, it is something else entirely. It is the story of the moment a great empire discovered that military power without financial power is theater, that the ability to project force is worthless if your creditor refuses to fund production, and that the most devastating weapon in modern geopolitics is not a nuclear bomb or an aircraft carrier. It is a phone call from a Treasury secretary to a central bank. Today, we are going to go inside that weekend. We are going to understand not just what happened at Suez, but why it happened, what it revealed, and why the lesson it teaches is more relevant today than it has ever been. Buckle up. This is the story of how the sun set on the British Empire, and it set faster than anyone expected. To understand how far Britain fell at Suez, you have to understand how high it stood before the fall. At the height of the British Empire in the early 20th century, London was the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. British banks financed railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in India, and ports in China. The city of London was a clearinghouse for global commerce in the way that Wall Street is today, but with a reach that extended to every inhabited continent. The Royal Navy maintained a two-power standard, meaning Britain kept a navy larger than the next 2 naval powers combined. This was not vanity. This was strategy. British trade routes circled the globe. The Navy protected them, and the trade routes generated the wealth that funded the Navy that protected the trade routes. It was a self-reinforcing system of extraordinary power and elegance. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, was a jugular vein of the empire. The canal cut the journey from Britain to India by thousands of miles. It connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, Britain to its most valuable colonial possession, and the Royal Navy to every ocean simultaneously. When Benjamin Disraeli secretly purchased a controlling stake in the canal from the cash-strapped Egyptian Khedive in 1875, it was considered one of the greatest diplomatic coups in British history. For 80 years, Britain treated the Suez Canal as sovereign territory. British troops guarded it. British officials managed it. British ships had priority passage. The canal was not just infrastructure. It was a physical embodiment of Britain's global reach. And then came the 2 world wars, and everything changed. Britain won the Second World War. That is the official story, and it is technically accurate. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany for more than a year after the fall of France. Its Royal Air Force won the Battle of Britain. Its Navy kept the Atlantic supply lines open. Its soldiers fought in North Africa, Italy, Burma, and Northwest Europe. It was a genuine military achievement of extraordinary scale. But it was also financial suicide. To fight the war, Britain liquidated virtually everything it owned abroad. Foreign investments that had taken a century to accumulate were sold in years. Gold reserves were depleted. Dollar assets were stripped to their bones. The national debt, which had been substantial before the war, reached levels that would have seemed fantastical in 1939. The Lend-Lease arrangement with America, which provided Britain with the weapons and materials it needed to survive, came with terms that Churchill privately described as more ruinous than defeat. When Lend-Lease was abruptly terminated in August 1945, the day Japan surrendered, Britain had to negotiate an emergency loan from the United States under conditions that any honest observer would describe as humiliating. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 provided Britain with $3.75 billion at 2% interest. This sounds generous. The conditions were not. Britain was required to make sterling convertible to dollars within 1 year. When it did so in July 1947, the result was a run on the pound so severe that convertibility had to be suspended after just 5 weeks. The dollar reserve that Britain had painstakingly accumulated were almost entirely drained in that catastrophic month. By 1947, Britain was rationing food more severely than it had during the war. The winter of 1947 was one of the coldest on record, and there was not enough coal to heat homes. The country was bankrupt in any honest accounting. The empire was trying to maintain troops in Palestine, troops in India, troops in Greece, troops in Germany, troops across the Middle East, was consuming resources that Britain simply did not have. And yet the fiction of great power status had to be maintained, because to admit the reality would be to invite every nationalist movement, every territorial challenger, every Soviet probe to test a weakness. Better to keep up appearances, better to bluff, better pretend, at least for a little while longer, that Britain was still the empire that had won the war. The problem with bluffing is that eventually someone calls you. Gamal Abdel Nasser had been watching the British Empire carefully since he came to power in Egypt in 1952. What he saw was not strength. What he saw was performance. The uniforms, the flags, the ceremonies, the carefully cultivated mystique of imperial power, all of it covering a financial reality that Nasser, who had studied the numbers, knew to be catastrophic. Nasser wanted to build the Aswan High Dam. The dam would control the flooding of the Nile, irrigate millions of acres of agricultural land, and provide electricity for Egypt's industrialization. It was the centerpiece of his vision for an independent, modern, powerful Egypt. He needed financing. The Americans and the British initially agreed to help fund the dam. Then, in July 1956, they abruptly withdrew their offer. The reasons were complex. Cold War politics, Nasser's decision to recognize communist China, concerns about Egypt's relationship with the Soviet Union, American domestic politics. But the effect of the withdrawal was to humiliate Nasser publicly. At the exact moment he was trying to position himself as the leader of Arab nationalism and anti-colonial resistance. Nasser responded 7 days later with one of the most audacious acts of economic nationalism in the 20th century. On July 26, 1956, in a public speech in Alexandria, he announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. Egyptian forces moved to seize the canal facilities. The company's assets, management, and revenues were transferred to the Egyptian government overnight. The reaction in London was immediate and volcanic. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, already in poor health and dangerously misreading the situation, compared Nasser to Hitler. He told his cabinet that Nasser must be destroyed. The language was not diplomatic. It was personal and visceral and extremely dangerous. Eden and his French counterparts had multiple reasons to intervene. For Britain, the canal was the last physical symbol of imperial greatness in the Middle East. For France, Nasser was arming Algerian rebels fighting against French colonialism. For Israel, Egypt was a strategic threat that had been blockading Israeli shipping through the canal. The three countries had converging interests, and they decided to act on them together. What followed was one of the most disastrously planned military and political operations in modern history. In October 1956, representatives of Britain, France, and Israel met secretly at a villa in Sèvres, a suburb of Paris. What they discussed was a conspiracy that, if it had become public immediately, would have ended careers, destroyed alliances, and possibly brought down governments. The plan was as follows. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, moving toward the canal. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum demanding that both Egypt and Israel withdraw from the canal zone, knowing that Israel would comply and Egypt would refuse. This would provide Britain and France with a pretext to intervene militarily to protect the canal. Eden could present the operation to Parliament and the world as peacekeeping, as protecting an international waterway, as acting responsibly to separate combatants, not as a naked act of imperial retrenchment that it actually was. The Israelis moved first. On October 29th, Israeli paratroopers landed in the Sinai, and Israeli armor drove west toward the canal. Within hours, Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Nasser rejected it. The following day, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian air bases. On November 5th, British and French paratroopers landed at Port Said, at the northern end of the canal. Militarily, the operation was going well. The Egyptians were outmatched. The canal was in British and French reach. Eden appeared to be getting away with it. And then the phone call started. Dwight Eisenhower was furious, not just diplomatically irritated, genuinely, personally furious in a way that the official histories have sometimes underplayed. Eisenhower had specifically asked Eden not to take military action. He had sent personal messages. He had made his position clear. And Eden had deceived him, had allowed Eisenhower to believe that Britain would pursue a diplomatic solution while secretly planning the collusion with France and Israel that produced a military assault. The deception enraged Eisenhower. But what motivated his response was not just personal anger. It was cold strategic calculation. The United States was in the middle of a presidential election. More importantly, America was fighting a global ideological war against the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of a newly decolonizing world. Every act of European imperial aggression against an Arab nation handed the Soviets a propaganda victory of incalculable value. The Soviets, seeing an opportunity, sent notes to Britain, France, and Israel threatening missile strikes if the operation did not stop. Whether Khrushchev was serious is debatable. What is not debatable is Eisenhower's response to Soviet threats. He called them reckless and dismissed them. He then proceeded to do what the Soviets could only threaten. He destroyed Britain economically. The mechanism was the pound sterling. Britain's currency was under severe pressure. The Suez operation, the uncertainty it created, and the international condemnation it generated were causing capital to flee sterling. The Bank of England was losing reserves at an alarming rate. Britain desperately needed to draw from its quota at the International Monetary Fund to stabilize the pound. The United States effectively blocked the IMF drawing. Treasury Secretary George Humphrey made the American position clear. There would be no IMF support. There would be no American assistance. And more than that, the United States would actively sell sterling from its own reserves, further undermining the pound, unless Britain announced an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Harold Macmillan, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer and who had been one of the most enthusiastic advocates of the military operation, received a Treasury briefing on the pound's position and changed his mind almost instantaneously. He went from hawk to dove in a single meeting when the numbers were put in front of him. Britain had enough dollar reserves to survive for approximately 6 weeks at the rate they were being depleted. Without IMF support and with active American selling of sterling, the pound would collapse. The British government, which was already borrowing heavily to maintain its welfare state and its military commitments, would face a debt crisis of existential proportions. The pound's role as a reserve currency, already diminished, would be destroyed entirely. The guns were working. The military operation was succeeding, but the money was running out. And when you are an empire fighting a war on credit, when your creditor tells you the credit is withdrawn, you have a choice between military victory and economic survival. Eden chose economic survival. On the evening of November 6th, barely 24 hours after the paratroopers had landed, Britain announced a ceasefire. The operation was over. The humiliation had begun. What happened next is almost as extraordinary as what preceded it, because Britain did not accept the reality that Suez had revealed. It did not draw the obvious conclusion that a country with Britain's finances could not sustain the global military posture of a great power. Instead, it did what Britain had been doing since 1945. It pretended. Anthony Eden resigned citing ill health, which was true in the immediate sense, but obscured the political reality that he had been forced out by the catastrophic failure of his signature policy. Harold Macmillan, who had helped drive the decision to invade and then reversed himself when the financial consequences became clear, became prime minister. Macmillan was a masterful political performer. He coined the phrase supermac in his own honor and presided over a period of genuine prosperity with the message that the British people had never had it so good. The military commitments continued. Britain maintained forces in Germany, in the Middle East, in the Far East, in the Caribbean. It tested its own nuclear weapons. It maintained a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. It participated in the founding of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It kept up every performance of great power status that it could. The cost was staggering. Britain was spending money it did not have to maintain a posture it could not sustain. The defense budget consumed resources that Germany and Japan, both defeated and occupied after the war, both stripped of their military capacity, were plowing into industrial investment. By the 1960s, the economic divergence was becoming impossible to ignore. Germany was industrializing rapidly. Japan was becoming a global manufacturing power. Britain was still paying for the theater of imperial grandeur. There were moments of clarity. The 1968 decision to withdraw from east of Suez to end Britain's military presence in the Persian Gulf, Southeast Asia, and the Far East was a genuine recognition that the finances could not support the global posture. Dennis Healey, the defense secretary who made the decision, called a necessary and long overdue adjustment to reality. He was right. It had been long overdue since 1956. But even then, the pretending continued in smaller ways. The nuclear deterrent was maintained. The Permanent Security Council seat was defended. The special relationship with America was cultivated as if it were a partnership of equals rather than the relationship of a declining power to its indispensable patron. The language of great power status was carefully preserved even as the substance ebbed away. The Suez Crisis teaches a lesson that is as relevant today as it was in 1956. Perhaps more relevant. Military power without financial power is theater. Britain in 1956 had a functioning military. It had paratroopers capable of seizing the canal. It had aircraft that could bomb Egyptian airfields. It had warships that could dominate the eastern Mediterranean. By the military calculus, Britain was capable of doing what it set out to do, but it was doing all of this on a credit card. And when the creditor called in the card, the military capability became irrelevant. The guns could not shoot dollars. The paratroopers could not parachute into foreign exchange markets. The warships could not defend the pound. This lesson is not unique to Britain. It is the fundamental lesson of great power economics in the modern era. The Soviet Union collapsed not because it was militarily defeated, but because its economy could not sustain its military ambitions. The United States financed the Vietnam War by debasing its currency, which contributed to the monetary crisis that ended the Bretton Woods system. Every empire in history has discovered, at some point, that the limits of military power are financial limits. For Britain, Suez was the brutal and public lesson that the empire was over. The financial reality that had existed since 1945 was now impossible to deny. Britain was a medium-sized European nation with the commitments and the posture of a global superpower. The gap between what it was and what it was pretending to be had been exposed in the most humiliating way possible. Eisenhower understood this perfectly. He was not being cruel to Britain for the sake of it. He was making a cold calculation that American interests were not served by European imperial adventures in the Middle East, and that if Britain needed to be taught this lesson by financial pressure rather than words, so be it. The lesson was administered with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness. The parallel to the present should not be missed. Any nation that projects military power while running chronic deficits, that maintains global commitments on borrowed money, that depends on continued willingness of creditors to fund its ambitions, is in a position structurally similar to Britain in 1956. The specific actors change. The underlying dynamic does not. The Suez Crisis did not just end British imperial ambitions. It established a template for how financial power supersedes military power in the modern world, and that template has been used repeatedly in the decades since. The United States weaponized dollar access in its response to the 1956 crisis. It deployed the same weapon against Russia's frozen reserves in 2022. The swift exclusion, the asset freezes, the secondary sanctions, these are all variations on the same instrument that Eisenhower deployed against Eden. The dollar as a weapon rather than a neutral medium of exchange. The financial system as a coercive tool rather than a public utility. But there is a twist that Britain did not have to worry about in 1956. The United States today faces a version of the same structural problem that Britain faced then, not immediately, not identically, but structurally. The parallels are there for anyone willing to look at them honestly. America runs a current account deficit. America's national debt is $36 trillion. America's ability to project military power globally depends on continued willingness of the world to fund its deficits by holding dollars. As we have covered in our videos on the petrodollar, on gold, on BRICS, and on de-dollarization, that willingness is not what it once was. The irony of Suez is that the country that deployed financial power to break Britain has spent the decades since creating the conditions for its own financial vulnerability, not through malice, not through stupidity, but through the natural dynamics of great power overstretched that make every empire, eventually, a cautionary tale. Eden saw Nasser as Hitler. He saw himself as Churchill. He saw the canal as the Rhineland. He was wrong about all three. He was looking at the present through the lens of the past, fighting the last war, applying lessons that had stopped being relevant without realizing it. The historians of the future may look at the early 21st century and see similar patterns in different actors. The projection of force without the financial foundation to sustain it. The defense of privilege by methods that accelerate its erosion. The gap between what a power is and what it is pretending to be, growing wider and more expensive to maintain with every passing year. Empires rarely admit they're declining. They maintain the performance. They keep up appearances. They insist on respect they can no longer compel. And then one day, a phone call comes from a Treasury Secretary, and the guns fall silent because the money has run out. Britain pretended it hadn't happened. For a remarkably long time, the pretending almost worked. But the reality of 1956 shaped every major British foreign policy decision for the next 50 years. You cannot unknow what Suez taught. You can only choose whether to learn from it or to repeat it. If this video gave you a clearer picture of how military power and financial power interact in the modern world, hit the like button. The algorithm actively suppresses historical content that connects directly to the present, and your engagement is what gets it to the people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the patterns that mainstream commentary misses. And tell me in the comments, which contemporary power do you think is most in danger of its own Suez moment? I want to read your analysis. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and keep watching.